In today's video, we're taking a look at the 10 biggest NHL Draft Busts since 2009. We'll jump into that coming up next. So welcome back to another video here at Top Shelf Hockey. As I mentioned, today we're taking a look at some of the biggest NHL Draft Busts really since 2009. There's all kinds of players that have worked out great for NHL teams. Some have been considered draft steals that were taken later, but there's a lot of really early high picks that have not worked out and certainly have some of these NHL teams wishing they had an opportunity for a do-over here. And of course, yesterday we took a look at some of the biggest draft steals in the same time frame, and today we're jumping in to these draft busts. We're not going to get into too many draft busts for the last few drafts. We're going to give those players a little bit of slack and give them more time to develop here. So we're going to go all the way back to 2009 and take a look at the 10 biggest busts here, in my opinion. First up, we have 2009 NHL draft Scott Glennie, taken number 8th overall by the Dallas Stars, drafted from the Brandon Wheat Kings of the Western Hockey League. Now, Scott Glennie was a player who had lots of great players go above him. It was a pretty solid draft in the early part of this round. Tavares, Hedman, Duchesne, Kane, Shen, Ekman Larson, Kadri. Things were going very well. Teams making great selections. And then Glennie turned out to really be the first big draft bust of this draft. Now, unfortunately for the Stars, they do have the opportunity to project some other players here. They could have went down the route of getting like a Ryan Ellis, who's worked out great for Nashville, or even a Chris Kreider, who the Rangers selected a little bit later. I mean, Scott Glennie did have a solid end to his junior career, putting up 89 and 91 point seasons after being drafted, 30 plus goals, almost 60 assists. Overall, had a pretty solid junior career playing in the Western Hockey League, but never translated at all to the NHL, or really even not great in the AHL either. His career high in the American Hockey League is 37 points over 70 games. He played for about 4 years with the Texas Stars. Appeared in one NHL game for Dallas before moving on for one final year in the AHL with the Manitoba Moose. And clearly Scott Glennie's pro hockey career never worked out at all, and the Dallas Stars, I'm sure, would really like to have a do-over in this selection. Next up, also from the 2009 NHL Draft, is Louie LeBlanc, selected by the Montreal Canadiens, number 18th overall. Of course, a French-Canadian born near the Montreal area. Certainly had a lot of hope and a lot of pressure to become the next big French-Canadian star for the Habs. Of course, he played down in the USHL prior to being drafted. He had committed to going to Harvard upon the draft being taking place as well, and he did play one season of college hockey with Harvard University. Went on to play one season after that in the Quebec Major Junior Hockey League for the Montreal Juniors. His season at Harvard was okay, but not great. Figured it was better for his development to jump over to the Q, where he put up 58 points in 51 games. Not bad, but for somebody who's, with his supposed pedigree, should have done a little bit better, but overall still pretty decent year, better than it was in Harvard. Next year, he split the year in the NHL and AHL, not doing great at either one, but a little bit better in the minors. Put up 22 points in 31 games for the Hamilton Bulldogs, who was the AHL affiliate at the time for Montreal. Played 42 games in the NHL, put up 10 points. The next year, he spent mostly in the American Hockey League. 8 games for the Habs that year. No points, no really anything on the score sheet. And then he played a couple more years in the American Hockey League. Ended up getting traded over to the Ducks, and then eventually went over to the KHL and played in Europe a little bit, not a whole lot, before eventually leaving pro hockey here altogether. Now, Louie LeBlanc was a player, like I said, had tons of promise, tons of potential, never realized it at all. The Montreal Canadiens could have possibly taken a player like Chris Kreider, who was the very next selection in the draft, taken by the New York Rangers. Can you imagine what that team would be like today if they hadn't taken Kreider over LeBlanc? Next up, we're jumping over to the 2010 draft, and the 3rd overall pick, defenseman Erika Branson, selected by the Florida Panthers, drafted from the Ontario Hockey League's Kingston Frontenacs. Now, don't get me wrong, Branson's had a semi-okay NHL career. At least he's been a regular NHL player. He's got into 518 games so far, put up 73 points. But looking back at that draft, there's no way he should have been the 3rd overall selection. Of course, this was the Hall Seguin draft, and there's plenty of other great talent that went after him, including Ryan Johansson, Vladimir Tarasenko. You got Kevin Hayes, Evgeny Kuznetsov, Charlie Coyle, Brock Nelson, all kinds of other players who went on to have decent, solid NHL careers. Many even taken in the later rounds. as well. And obviously Branson didn't really come as advertised and didn't turn out to be the player that the Panthers thought they were getting. Now, many thought he would be a Chris Pronger type of defenseman, which clearly has not worked out to be the case, but that's kind of what some scouts and some of the so-called experts around the draft thought he might become. Of course, he went on to play for the Florida Panthers for about 5 seasons before being traded to the Vancouver Canucks. He's jumped around a few more times since then, going from there to Pittsburgh and then over to Anaheim, where he's kind of starting to become a journeyman defenseman and not really putting up anything close to being the credentials you would think for a 3rd overall defenseman taken in his draft class. Next up, we're jumping over to the 2011 NHL Draft and looking at Toronto Maple Leafs pick Tyler Biggs, who went 22nd overall and never made it to the NHL, does not have any NHL games to his name, certainly never lived up to the hype. There were some other players in the first round who also didn't really pan out, but for the most part, Biggs is the only player drafted in the first 22 spots who didn't at least play one NHL games, which is why I'm deeming him the biggest bust. Of course, he came from the U.S. National Team Development Program, had some okay numbers there, went on to play for Miami University right after being drafted, put up 17 points, 37 games, didn't have a great year, jumped over to the Ontario Hockey League, went to the Canadian Junior route, had an okay season for a player who was 2 years past development after being drafted. 53 points in 60 games was good, but not fantastic for a player that should be of his caliber and age level. And then he went on to play several years between the AHL as well as the East Coast League, where he spent the bulk of his career. Played even 1 year over in the EIHL in the UK over for the Nottingham Panthers as well, and then back to the East Coast League before wrapping things up. But Tyler Biggs never worked out for the Leafs at all, never got into any NHL games. They also had a few picks later, number 25 overall, where they took defenseman Stuart Percy. Now, he did play 12 games in the NHL, but never panned out either. Certainly not a great draft for the Maple Leafs. Next up, we have the biggest draft bust of this timeline, in my opinion, and that's first overall pick of the 2012 draft to the Edmonton Oilers, Nail Yakupov. Now, Yakupov has never panned out. Of course, being a first overall pick, you expect to get a high-quality superstar, and he was anything but. Of course, he played a couple of years in the OHL for the Sarnia Sting, leading to the draft, put up a 100-point season, and was really coming into the draft with a lot of hype and a lot of potential. His first full year was immediately following the draft, 2012-13, which was, of course, a shortened season, 48 games, 31 points is what he put up, including 17 goals. Things look to be decent. I mean, for a rookie year on a first overall pick, that is not terrible at all, but things never materialized from there. The best he ever did after that in a full year was 33 points, never cracked 20 goals, bounced around to a few teams, ended up playing for the Blues as well as the Avalanche before heading back to play in a KHL for St. Petersburg SKA. We'll see if he ever returns. It's probably doubtful, but Yakupov never turned out to be anywhere close to what the Oilers thought they were getting when they drafted him first overall. Next up, we're staying with the 2012 draft. We don't have to go far, just a couple picks down. Number 4 overall, Griffin Reinhart to the New York Islanders. Of course, the big defenseman who played in the Western Hockey League for the Edmonton Oil Kings. Clearly, Griffin Reinhart never worked out. He played a grand total so far of 37 NHL games, putting up 2 assists. Last played in the NHL in the 2016-17 NHL season. Now, unfortunately, even though the Oilers are not the ones who selected Reinhart, they were impacted by this pick and had their hands all over the top part of the draft. But for the Islanders to select him where they did certainly was a bad idea, clearly looking back now in retrospect. The very next pick, if they really wanted a top defenseman, was Morgan Rielly, who's having a tremendous career with the Toronto Maple Leafs. So clearly lots of other options, even including guys like Hampus Lindholm, Matt Dumba, Jacob Trouba, all went picks shortly thereafter. Lots of great defensemen who could have been had for a much better career than Griffin Reinhart ever dreamed of. Of course, the New York Islanders, fortunately for them, were able to trade him not long after only playing a grand total of 8 NHL games, traded him to the Edmonton Oilers ahead of the 2015 NHL draft, and they got 2 draft picks in return, including a first and a second round pick. So this was Peter Chiarelli's one of his first moves as GM of the Oilers, which was enough to get him fired, in my opinion. This was a ridiculous trade. They gifted players like Matthew Barzal to the New York Islanders while taking on Griffin Reinhart, who never worked out at all. Of course, he mostly played for their American Hockey League team for a few years before eventually moving on to the Vegas organization, where he's played with the AHL team there for a few years, and now he's over in the KHL this past season. So Griffin Reinhart, one of the bigger busts, and unfortunately for the Oilers, had their hands all over this one as well. Next up, we jump ahead to the 2014 NHL Draft and 5th overall selection by the New York Islanders, Michael Dal Colle. That's a couple of selections now by the Islanders on this list. Dal Colle was a little bit, maybe we'll call him a late bloomer, I don't know, trying to carve out a spot for himself in the NHL. He's now appeared in 85 games, putting up 17 points. But looking at the draft here in 2014, of course, the guys that went ahead of him so far have all played relatively solid, NHL hockey. Different degrees, though. I think we could certainly make an argument for some of these players being in different order like we've done in other redrafts. The Islanders could have had a guy like William Nylander, Nick Ehlers, Dylan Larkin, all kinds of other players, even David Pastrnak, who went much later into the second round. Lots of options for these guys, but Dal Colle certainly came out of junior hockey with a pretty solid pedigree, putting up back-to-back 90-plus point seasons for the Oshawa Generals in the OHL, and then really never turned out. He went a long time before he even played his first NHL game. Never got an NHL game under his belt till the 17-18 season, played 4 games, no points, back down to the minors again for 18-19, except for, I guess, a bit of an NHL time. Last year, 19-20, he did certainly put up a regular NHL appearance, putting up 53 games and 10 points, trying to carve out a new role for himself, and maybe he'll be a regular NHL player for some time. Hard to say, but he's never going to live up to the hype of being drafted where he was. Next up, we're lumping these two together, but we're looking at the 2015 NHL Draft, where the Bruins had 3 consecutive first-round selections, and 2 out of the 3 have not worked out at all, and are arguably 2 of the biggest busts of the 2015 NHL Draft. Of course, that was the McDavid draft, followed by Jack Eichel, and the Bruins selected 13, 14, and 15, with the only pick so far working out being Jake DeBrusk, who went in the middle, but so far defenseman Jacob Zboril and winger Zach Senyshyn have not worked out at all, playing a grand total of 8 NHL games combined. Now, neither of these players have worked out at all. Looking at some other guys that they could have selected, the next pick right after Senyshyn was the Islanders taking Matthew Barzal. Can you imagine the Boston Bruins? They've been a really solid team ever since. But could they have added guys like Barzal, Kyle Connor, Thomas Chabot, Brock Besser, Travis Konechny, Jack Roslovic, Ilya Samsonov? Any of these guys would have been better picks. And even though the Bruins have been cup contenders, division leaders, they've had tremendous regular seasons. But can you imagine how much better this team could have been, and how many of those close calls of winning a Stanley Cup could have possibly been, clinched by now? This team could have been even more stacked for the future, considering some of their top players are getting older, like Chara and Bergeron and Marchand. These guys have really, they wasted 2 of these 3 picks and could have done much better had they picked a little bit more carefully. Next up, we're jumping ahead to the 2016 NHL Draft and looking at Canucks selection. Ollie Juolevi, who went number 5 overall from the London Knights of the Ontario Hockey League. Now, I hope Canuck fans are not too upset with me here, but I don't think it's too early to start labeling Juolevi as a draft bust. It's 2020, this was 4 years ago, and he has yet to play an NHL game. I'm not convinced that even if he becomes a regular NHL defenseman, that he'll ever live up to the hype, and he can certainly regret this pick based on other players that were available that came after. The very next selection was his London Knights teammate, Matthew Tkachuk. Would the Canucks not love to have Matthew Tkachuk in their lineup right now, or Clayton Keller, or Mikhail Sergachev if they really wanted another defenseman, Charlie McAvoy? Certainly lots of other guys who could have been selected here that would have been a much better selection for the Vancouver Canucks. Unfortunately, he's just not worked out. I know some of this is due to injuries that he's suffered, but Juolevi just has not come to be. I mean, he could still turn things around. He's played the last 2 seasons for the Utica Comets of the AHL. Last year, before the season was suspended, he played 45 games, but up 25 points. Reports were suggesting that he was improving. I guess we'll see if he ever becomes an NHL player, but even if he does, like I said, I think we're going to be safe to label him a draft bust here based on what he has yet to accomplish and may never live up to the hype. Will we get any players from the 17 or 18 drafts or even the 19 draft that will turn out to be a draft bust? Only time will tell. I know looking at the 17 draft, some players that might be trending that way, but it's still early. Guys like Nolan Patrick, obviously second overall pick, battling a lot of health issues. You got Elias Anderson with the Rangers that there's a lot of question marks around for sure. You've got Cal Foote in Tampa, hasn't played a game as of yet, but I don't think there's too much to worry about there just yet. But some of these guys may or may not live up to the hype, and only time will tell. If you look at 2018, clearly some of these players might have started slow a little bit. Like I know there's a lot of Habs fans concerned about Kotkaniemi, where he spent a lot of time in the AHL this year. I know the Red Wings, but Zadina, obviously, has started a little slow, where guys like Brady Tkachuk's putting up back-to-back 20-goal seasons, and Dahlin and Svechnikov have been playing very well, but they're still early. Quinn Hughes obviously had a strong start for the Canucks this year as well, and there's lots of time for these players to develop here. So I guess we'll have to look back at this a little bit later to see if these guys turn out to be busts or if they've met expectations. So that is my list of the top 10 biggest draft busts since 2009. Of course, as always, we'll know your thoughts and opinions on these players, any other players you thought should be included in this list here as well, and we can continue the conversation down in the comment section. Of course, if you're new to the channel, consider subscribing and turning on your notifications so you don't miss any of our future content. Even with the NHL season being on pause right now, we still have videos coming out every single day. Thank you for watching, and I will catch you next time.